Hello everyone, it's Player Mike, I hope you're all well. Today we are back with Lord of the Rings Total War Remastered, and we're doing a faction guide and overview for Mordor. Mordor has the accolade as being the only faction in the selection screen that is rated as easy. That's down to how quick it is to build up and replenish armies, as well as the strength of their late game units like the Trolls. They also have a comfortable starting position with natural protection afforded by the mountains, and the Harad and the Eastlings securing their south and eastern borders. In this video, I'm going to run through how the economy works, recruitment, campaign strategy, and lastly a full showcase of the units on the battlefield. I'll start with the unique characters and generals. If we go to the family tree, we will see the faction leader is of course Sauron. We then have the 9 Nazgul led by the Witch King, and lastly there is Gothmog, who is the commander of the forces of Mordor when they laid siege to Minas Tirith. Sauron starts in Barad-dûr, which is the capital. He can't be moved from this location unless he has the ring, so you need to capture the ring with a named character like a general, and then trade it to Sauron via the treasure screen. Sauron himself is a single entity unit. He's got very powerful stats, but he is vulnerable to ranged fire, and he doesn't last as long in a fight as you might expect. The Witch King starts at Minas Morgul. He actually can't move on the first turn, but he can move on every turn thereafter. He has the Fell Beast bodyguard unit, or the Fell Beast mount, which again is a very powerful unit, but also vulnerable to ranged fire. Sometimes it's a good idea to try and soak up enemy archer fire with some weaker units, and then send in the Fell Beast when your opponents are out of ammo. The Fell Beast mount also gives him additional movement points, so he does have a lot of range or movement range. Witch King does have a custom portrait and model. When the Witch King dies, he will respawn the next turn, but after he dies for the first time, he will lose the custom portrait and his custom model, so he'll just look like a regular Nazgul. He'll be the Witch King in name only. He does have the Witch King trait though, which is also very strong. It gives you +5 command, +2 management, and +3 influence, as well as giving the general some more hit points. The other thing to note is that when he dies, there is a 50% chance that when he respawns he will have the Fell Beast bodyguard unit, and a 50% chance that he will have the Blackguard cavalry unit bodyguard instead of the Fell Beast, but both are very powerful units in their own right. Then we come on to the regular Nazgul. We have one at Nurnen, another at Nargothrond, one at Durthang, and then the last Nazgul in Moran. So you'll notice that we are 4 Nazgul down at the start of the campaign, and that's because 4 of them start off dead, but on the second turn one will respawn, on the third turn another will respawn, so it takes 4 turns to get up to the full 9 Nazgul. All of your starting Nazgul have the Blackguard's cavalry unit, and they all start with 4 units of experience, which just gives you +4 to defense and melee attack. When the Nazgul die, they do respawn the next turn just outside of Barad-dûr, or in this location, and when the regular Nazgul respawn, there is a 25% chance they will have the Fell Beast, and a 75% chance that they will have the Blackguard's cavalry bodyguard. So with the 4 that spawn in the first 4 turns, there's a good chance you'll get 1 or 2 Fell Beasts in there. Something else as well is that when the Nazgul die, they will lose their traits and treasures. So they will respawn with the Nazgul trait, which is a strong trait, but obviously they lose most of their experience and other traits that you have built up. So, I mean, try not to lose them, but it's not the end of the world if you do, because they do just respawn. When they do respawn for the first time, they also get an upgrade to their attack and defense, so they will respawn with the silver shield and silver sword in their portrait, indicating those upgrades. Lastly then, we have Gothmog, who just starts outside of Minas Morgul. He actually does have a custom model. So his bodyguard is the Orc Champions unit, which is the generic General's bodyguard for Mordor. So any general that spawns in after the start of the campaign, excluding the Nazgul and the Witch King, will have the Orc Champions bodyguard. The generic model for the Mordor generals is actually just the Nazgul. So when a new general spawns in, they will have the Orc Champions and they will have this model, even though they won't actually be Nazgul. The Orc Champions unit is a mediocre melee infantry unit, I would say. The defense of 22 and melee attack of 7 is fine, but as bodyguard units go, when you compare this to the men, the elves, and the dwarves, this is much weaker. But the strength just comes from the high number at 124, which is about double that of the regular dwarves and elven bodyguard units. The Nazgul have quite low unit sizes at 32, but then they won't replenish above 16. So it's a bit like the Fellowship Generals in that you have a lot of them, but they have very low unit sizes. So actually, 2 or 3 Nazgul would be the equivalent to a regular general unit just because of that low unit size. Lastly then, we have the Assassin, Spy and Diplomat, which I also wanted to talk about because I like the way they have been implemented in this mod. So the Eye of Sauron acts as the spy. You can go around. Shelob is the assassin. You pick off targets with Shelob. And then lastly, the Mouth of Sauron is the diplomat. Lovely models, as always. And then I usually show all the models for the generals as well. I can't get Sauron to move, but I will put some footage in of him moving here. And with the Witch King, he can't move on turn 1 either, but I'll put some footage of him moving here as well. In this section, I'm going to discuss how the economy works. With the forces of evil factions, it works slightly differently to the good factions, in that they don't get farms, ports, roads, or traders, which would usually be the backbone of your economy. Instead, the evil factions such as Mordor make most of their money through taxes, and that's because they get various tax bonuses from different buildings. So if we go to our building tree here, we will see that the spawning pits, which is one of the core recruiting buildings as Mordor, gives you population growth. So that will accelerate population growth in the settlements. The forge will give you a tax income bonus, which increases through the levels. Additionally, in Barad-dûr you have the Tower of Barad-dûr, which gives you a tax income bonus. But in every settlement, apart from Barad-dûr, you can build the Idol of the Eye. So this building tree here, which gives you another tax income bonus. And then lastly, every settlement that's in the realm of Mordor will give you a further tax income bonus, 10% and more population growth. So when you take all those, when you take the population growth from the spawning pits as the realm of Mordor building cards, and then the tax income bonuses from the Idol of the Eye, Forge, and these building cards, you're able to generate massive tax revenues. You can see in Barad-dûr that about 90% of that income is coming from taxes. So a good economic strategy to pursue is, I would say, to get the... You do usually want to get the spawning pits first, just because when it comes to the evil factions, recruiting units has a very detrimental effect on your population levels, because your units only take one turn to recruit and they have massive unit sizes, so your population will start to fall very quickly if you're recruiting units regularly. So getting the population growth from the spawning pits is not only important for that, but also to increase your population to take advantage of the tax income. As the second building, I'd usually go for the forge, just because that gives you the tax income bonus, which will further increase that tax income. But between the settlements in Mordor, which have the Realm of Mordor building card, you should be able to generate income to fund you through most of the early to mid game. Obviously, once you get outside of the Realm of Mordor, like into Osgiliath or Minas Tirith, they won't have the building cards, which give you the 10% income or 10% tax income bonus and the 3.5% population growth, but you can still get the tax income bonus from the forge and the Idol of the Eye, and then you can still get the population growth from the spawning pits. So even once you're outside of Mordor, tax will be your primary revenue stream. So aside from tax, there are other income streams. So even though the evil factions don't have, or generally don't have farms, some of them do, but Mordor doesn't, the slavery will act as a farming building replacement in some ways. So if you go to a settlement which has hidden resource farm, which means you can build farms, the slavery, well, you can build farms if you're a faction that can build them. The slavery will give you increased farmland. So if we go to Nurnen, which has hidden resource farm, we'll see that the slave selection gives you increased farmland, and that will allow you to increase your farming income. Aside from that, Mordor are able to build mines. So if we go to Nargothrond, for example, you can see they get the 3 tiers of the mine. Only the dwarves get access to the 4th tier, so they're not really at a disadvantage there. In terms of those mines, to build up to tier 3, a region needs to have the ore resource that you can see here. If you just have the minerals resource, which is just this blue object, then you can only build tier 1 of the mines. So in Minas Morgul, we've only got the minerals, we don't have the ore, so we can only build the surface mines there. And it's a good idea to prioritize building mines in the settlements which have both ore and minerals, because in those settlements you'll actually get 2 different revenue streams from the ore and the minerals. So for example, if I select the surface mines in Nargothrond, because we have both mining resources, you can see we get 300 and 150. So because Mordor is a naturally mountainous region, you can build mines in most of these places because you can see the mining resources on the map. So that's another good revenue stream for Mordor. I'd say that's about it for the economy. In general, Mordor does not struggle to make money. I've never really had financial issues with them. All I would say is that once you get out of Mordor, especially once you get to a bit further in the campaign, when you're sort of halfway across the map, that's when it does become difficult, or a bit more difficult, because it's only the Realm of Mordor which gets the massively increased population growth and tax bonuses. So as you conquer more of the map, the Realm of Mordor regions that are going to support you through most of the early to mid game that money won't go as far anymore, because you're going to need a lot more armies once you start getting to this stage, and the settlements that you conquer won't generate as much in income because they don't have that building card. But you can still generate a good tax revenue just from the forge pits and the Idol of the Eye. As you do expand further west and out of the realm of Mordor, the slavery building line will become more important, because there's a lot more regions in these areas which have hidden resource farm, and therefore will give you the increased farmland bonus from the slavery. So the farming income stream will become more important as you expand across the map. And that will be able to replace some of the lost tax income from the realm of Mordor. So next I'll move on to recruitment. In this section I'm going to run through how recruitment works. When playing as Mordor, there are 5 recruitment buildings. There are 2 which give you access to most of your orc units, being the spawning pits and the forge. There's then a Mordor barracks which you can build in places which have hidden resource Easterlings and Harad, where you can get some of the Easterling and Harad units. Then you have the troll pens which give you access to your trolls. And there's also the warg pens which give you access to warg riders. So that's all the buildings at a high level. Next I'm going to talk about them in detail. The spawning pit is the most basic of recruitment buildings. That gives you access to quite a number of your orc units. It also gives you population growth, which is very important when playing as an orc faction, because you recruit a lot of orcs very quickly. So that will decimate your population levels in settlements unless you have a good population growth rate. So it's important to get this up and running and get to the higher levels. There are actually 4 tiers of the spawning pit, but there's 2 levels at the large town tier. So it's only showing 1, but there is actually a lesser orc spawning pit in the middle here. You can build the spawning pits in any settlement regardless of where it is. The only restrictions on this building are that to get the Greater Orc Spearman and Greater Orc Warband from tier 4 of the spawning pit, that region needs to have hidden resource orc, which generally is just those in and around Mordor. So I've taken Lynn here for the purposes of this video, just to show that in this settlement, tier 4 of the spawning pit doesn't give you those greater orc units. So you'll only get those around, or in and around Mordor. The next building then is the forge, which gives you the orc archers at tier 1 and then some slayer units at tier 2 and 3, which are basically just defensive units. The biggest selling point of the forge is the tax income bonus that you get from it. So between the increased population level that the spawning pit will allow through the increased growth rate and the tax income bonus from the forge, you can make a good tax revenue in most of your settlements. You can build the first 2 tiers of the forge in any settlement regardless of where it is, but to build tier 3 of the forge, that settlement needs to have hidden resource orc. So if we go back to Lynn here, we will see that we can't build tier 3 of the forge because this region doesn't have hidden resource orc. And that final tier of the forge just gives you the greater orc manslayers, which are not the best units. They're very low defense, but the melee attack of 6 is about as good as it gets on an orc unit, so they're not too bad. Then, as before, the Mordor barracks gives you access to the Harad and Eastling troops. To be able to build the Mordor barracks in a settlement, it must have hidden resource Rune or Harad, which generally is just their starting regions plus the surrounding rebel regions. So there's a number of settlements in this area that have both those resources. So if you want access to some stronger troops, then this is where to come. In terms of things to note about that, if that region also has the horses and the lesser horses resource, you can get some cavalry units. So Ubersesh is not a region that you start with, but I've just conquered it for this video. And we'll see here that the Mordor barracks gives you the Crimson Riders, which are Eastern Cavalry, and the Riders of Harad. And that's quite important because Mordor doesn't really get any cavalry, aside from the Warg Riders, which are quite hard to get. So if you do want cavalry, this is the place to come. That can be quite helpful against Gondor. Next then we have the Troll Pens. So in order to build the Troll Pens in a region, it must have hidden resource trolls. But there are different levels of that hidden resource, or different kinds. There's hidden resource Troll H and hidden resource Troll A. The one you're looking for is hidden resource Troll A, because that will get you, you'll be able to build 3 tiers of the troll caves, and the 3rd tier gives you the battle trolls, which are the best kind of trolls, the best performing. They are incredibly powerful units, and when you have these, it will make wars against Gondor very easy. There are 5 regions in the game which have that hidden resource Troll A, being Barad-dûr, Durthang, Minas Tirith, Nan Ungol, Orduga, Avesa, and yeah, that's the 5. So in all those regions I just read out there, you'll be able to build tier 3 of the troll pens and get those battle trolls. There's quite a lot of other regions which will have hidden resource Troll H, which is not the one you want, but that will give you access to some lesser forms of the troll. The last thing to talk about then is the wargs. So Mordor can recruit wargs from a warg pen, but to build the warg pen, the region must have the warg's resource. And there are only 5 regions in the game which have the warg's resource, being Isengard, Osten Edel, Kidrol Sin or Goblin Town, Gundabad, and lastly Latash. So Latash is not a region that you start with, but I just conquered it for this video just to show that you can build warg pens in this region because it has the wargs. But it is quite difficult to recruit the wargs, just given that Gundabad start with this region and then they probably will take Latash by the time they get there. Kidrol Sin starts under the control of the Orc Rebels, and then the Wildmen of Dunland are likely to make it to Osten Edel by the time that Mordor gets here, so it's difficult to pick up a region which has the warg resource, but it is possible to get them as Mordor. So now I'm going to move on to campaign strategy. In this section I'm going to cover campaign strategy. The first thing I would recommend doing is getting the tier 2 spawning pits set up in every region which doesn't have one. So for example, Durthang just has the Snagger spawning pit, or the tier 1 spawning pit. The reason we want the tier 2 spawning pit is because that gives you access to your first good orc units, being the lesser orc warband and spearmen. So for example, we have the tier 2 lesser orc spawning pit in Minas Morgul. And we can see that gives us the lesser orc spearmen and warband, which are the best orc units in the early game. They have respectable defense. As well as that, the orc spawning pits will increase your population growth, which is very important when playing as one of the orc factions, because you recruit units very quickly and that will have a very detrimental effect on your population levels unless you have a good growth rate. The second thing I would do is prioritize the tier 3 troll pens in places where you have hidden resource Troll A, which is Barad-dûr, Durthang, Nan Ungol, Orduga Avesa, and Minas Tirith. Because if you have hidden resource Troll A in a region, that allows you to get the tier 3 of the troll caves, which means you can recruit those battle trolls, which are one of the strongest units in the game. Once you get the battle trolls, the campaign will become far easier, but there's only a limited number of regions where you can get those. There are actually quite a lot of regions where you can get trolls, but it's only those 5 where you can get the hidden troll A, which gives you tier 3, and that means you can get the battle trolls. If it doesn't have hidden troll A, you can only get the first 2 tiers, and those trolls are not as strong. In terms of your direction, I would just go for Gondor straight away, because Gondor can grow into a very powerful nation, and they do start with a lot of units, but they are very spread out over quite a large area. They don't have a large number of troops on the east side, so with this army I would just go for Asgiliath straight away, and then from there I would try and grab these regions in the north here, so Henethynun, Ker Andros, Brimon and Calenhad, because if you take these regions in the north as well as Asgiliath, then Gondor is sort of contained to this area. And after that I would go for Emin, Arnon and Calengarth, because that means they are contained further. They can only really attack through this choke point here, so it's much easier to deal with them at that point. Just remember when you're fighting against Gondor that they take a lot longer to replenish their armies. Most of the human units take between 2 and 4 turns to recruit, whereas your orc units only take 1 turn. So even losing to Gondor is not necessarily a bad thing if you're whittling down their resources. Once you've got Gondor under control, the next faction you usually need to deal with is Rohan, because sometimes they expand east, and hopefully by that point you have got Gondor under control and you're starting to recruit the troll units. Once you have the troll units, Rohan is fairly easy to deal with, because they primarily rely on cavalry, which don't do well against the troll units. You do start with the settlement in the south of Mirkwood, Dol Guldur, but I haven't really found it to be that beneficial. I mean, hold it if you can, but if you lose it, it's not the end of the world. I think a centralised empire is more important than keeping Dol Guldur. The Lothlorien elves and the Sylvan elves rarely do much in the campaigns I've played. They don't really expand, so I wouldn't need to worry about them. In terms of your economy, once you've got your spawning pit set up, a good building to go for is just the Forge, just to get that increased tax bonus. And then you can further increase your income just by building mines in most of these settlements. As you expand past the realm of Mordor, you will no longer have the tax bonus and population growth from the realm of Mordor building cards, and you'll need to rely more on farming income that you get from the slavery building line. So that's just something to note. But I think that's about it. Mordor is the only campaign that's rated as easy in the faction selection screen, and I think that's just because you start out very powerful. It's very easy to raise armies, and you do have the 9 Nazgul generals that auto respawn when they die. Next I'll move on to the unit roster. In this section I'm going to do a full showcase of the units. The roster for Mordor is quite large. It starts with the orc units, which are inherently weak, but they are quick to recruit and you can build up armies with them in very little time. The strength comes from the sheer numbers rather than their stats. A unit of orcs will usually outnumber a human or elven unit at least 2 to 1. Then we have the trolls, which are slow to recruit but very powerful and can take hundreds of kills if you keep them away from archer fire. Then we have the warg riders, which provide some cavalry support. As we went through in the recruitment section, Mordor does have access to the Harad and Eastling units in certain regions, so you can recruit their cavalry if you need it, but this section will focus on the main Mordor units. Lastly, we have some of the Nazgul bodyguard units like the Fell Beasts and the Black Guards, which are also very powerful and one of the reasons that Mordor is rated as easy in the faction selection screen. I'll start with the Orc Snagger unit. This is the most basic Orc infantry, and it's very weak, similar to a peasant unit. It also takes 2 turns to recruit from tier 1 of the spawning pits, so it's not a unit I usually go for. There are better options which only take 1 turn to recruit. Next we have the Orc Scouts, which are the first skirmish unit. Usually I go for the Orc Archers in the early game when I'm looking for ranged units, because even though they have slightly lower missile attack at 10, they have far more ammo at 2400 compared to 720, but these are there if you want to use them. Then we have the Pit Guards, which you can also get from tier 1 of the spawning pits. Again, this is not a unit I usually go for. I usually try and rush the tier 2 of the spawning pits, so you can start getting the lesser Orc Spearmen and Warband, because in my opinion they are the first decent Orc unit. The Pit Guards are one of the only Orc units which has a low unit size at 120, so not usually something I recruit. But they are there if you only have tier 1 of the spawning pits. Then we have what I would say is the first usable Orc unit, the lesser Orc Spearmen. The defense of 11 doesn't look great, but as Orc units go, that's not too bad, especially in the early game. The melee attack of 2 is very low, but again, we're just recruiting them for that decent defense. This is the first Orc unit which has a good unit size combined with a decent defense. As well as that, they only take 1 turn to recruit, like most of the later Orc units do. So this is usually what I would go for in the early game, in conjunction with the lesser Orc Warband, which has very similar stats. Then we have the lesser Orc Warband, which is very similar to the lesser Orc Spearman. It just has +1 melee attack and -1 defense. But they also come from tier 2 of the spawning pits, and they take 1 turn to recruit. So either one of these units will do a job in the early game. Then we come on to some of the better Orc units that you can get from tier 3 of the spawning pits. So again, we get a boost in defense, but the melee attack stays fairly low at 3. But it's worth upgrading to the Orc Spearman over the lesser Orc Spearman just to get that increase in defense. Like with most of the Orc units, they do take 1 turn to recruit, and the upkeep is very low, so no reason not to go for these. Then we have the Orc melee infantry units from tier 3 of the spawning pits. So this unit goes hand in hand with the Orc Spearman, in that you get both of them from the upgrade to the tier 3 spawning pits. Like with the lesser Orc Warband, you get increased attack over the spear unit, but slightly lower defense. But again, either one of these units will do well in the mid game. Then we have the 2 elite tier Orc units, which you can only get from tier 4 of the spawning pits if that region has Hidden Resource Orc, the Greater Orc Spearman, and Greater Orc Warband. But you've probably realised how this works by now. At each upgrade to the spawning pits, you get a spear unit and an infantry unit. So again, with the Spearman, we get an upgrade to defense and a reasonable melee attack of 4. And then with the melee infantry units, we get decent defense and a good melee attack of 5. But again, there's no reason not to recruit these. All the Orc units generally take 1 turn to recruit and have a very low upkeep cost. This is how the Greater Orc Warbands look. Then we have the first and only Orc Arch units, the Orc Archers. The missile attack and missile range of 10 and 110 is about as low as it gets for Arch units, and the defense and melee attack is also fairly lackluster. But if you do want to use Archers, then you can get these fairly easily in the early game. You can actually recruit the Easterling Archers from regions in the east which have the Hidden Resource rune. So if you do want some better Archers, then you can go for them. Then we have 2 Slayer units from the Forge. The Orc Manslayers come from tier 2 of the Forge, and the Greater Orc Manslayers come from tier 3 of the Forge. To build tier 3 of the Forge, you need that region to have Hidden Resource Orc, so these units are a bit more exclusive. But the Slayer units focus on offense rather than defense. But in my opinion, I would rather go for some of the Warband or Spearman units. I think they're a better value for money. They have a similar level of attack, but they don't have a massively reduced defense. Then we have the aforementioned Greater Orc Manslayers, which again focus on offense rather than defense. They're a decent unit in terms of they have a good melee attack and charge, so they can do a lot of damage in a flank, but again, I would rather go for the warband or spear units over this unit, just to get that increased defense. Up next we have the Warg Riders, which are the Forces of Evil faction cavalry equivalent. Compared to cavalry, they do have fairly low stats. The defense of 15 is on the lower end, the melee attack of 7 is reasonable, as is the charge, but the strength of the Warg Riders comes from their unit size, which is 80, and that's about as high as it gets for a cavalry unit. And then they do have a bonus against horses, so they're quite effective cavalry killers. And lastly, they have armor piercing, which is quite unusual to see on a cavalry unit, so that will ignore half the target's armor value. But as we were going through in the recruitment section, it's quite difficult to get the Warg Riders because all the regions which have the Warg resource are quite far away from you and difficult to get, but you can either use the Black Guards or the Nazgul as your cavalry support, or recruit the Eastling cavalry as well, and Harad's cavalry from the east. Then we move on to the Troll units, which are very powerful. All the Troll units are quite similar in that they have plus hit points, decent defense, and melee attack. The best of the Troll units is the Battle Trolls, which are armoured trolls. These have the highest defense and melee attack out of the 4. And you can only get these from 5 regions in the game that I went through in the recruitment section. But essentially, these are incredibly powerful. If you get these into the battlefield, they'll be able to pick up hundreds of kills, and they really do help you through the mid to late game when you start going up against the stronger factions like the elves and the dwarves. These are the mounted trolls. This is the attack trolls, and these are the battle trolls. Then we have the Black Guards cavalry units, which is the bodyguards for the Nazgul if they don't have the Fell Beast. Again, this is just a solid cavalry unit. You've got the plus 2 hit points with a decent defense, so pretty tanky, a reasonable melee attack of 7, and a standard charge of 3. The Nazgul do generally have quite low unit sizes. I don't think they replenish above 16 when it comes to the Black Guards, but that's just to balance out the fact that you do have 9 of them. But a solid cavalry unit overall. Then we have the generic General's Bodyguard from Mordor, the Orc Champions. So every general that spawns in after the start of the campaign, excluding the respawning Nazgul, will have the Orc Champions as their bodyguard unit. This is an average unit if you compare it to human and elven factions, and that is defense and attack are mediocre. But it's like with most of the orc units, their strength comes from the size, and they do have a much bigger size than some of the human and elven bodyguard units. But overall, just a solid infantry unit. Last but not least, we have the Fell Beast, which is one of the potential bodyguard units for the Nazgul. This unit has incredibly high melee attack and charge, as well as morale. It's just very vulnerable to ranged fire. So if you can send in other units to soak up that ranged fire and then send in the Fell Beasts once your opponent is nearly out of ammo, they can do a lot of damage. That's going to be it for this one. I hope you enjoyed the faction guide and overview for Mordor, and I will see you on the next one.